Hi, time comes to start. This is a session, communication. I understand that the ICRP is originally based on the natural sciences, but today, social science and humanity is also important for the radiation protection. And this is a session for the social science and the humanities. Okay, let us allow to make some self-introduction, please.
Okay, yeah. I'm Frido Zölzer from the University of South Bohemia in the Czech Republic. I'm a radiation biologist turned ethicist, or I work a lot on radiation ethics or ethics of radiological protection, and I'm a member of C4.
I'm Shuichi that I am originally a social psychologist by training and now specializing in risk communication. And I am a member of task group 114, the reasonableness and tolerability. Yeah, that's all. Now, first, we'll introduce the poster and the videos concerning this session. Franklin Easley will explain this, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back from lunch. My name is Franklin Eze, and in a few minutes, I'll be summarizing some of the posters and videos presentations that were accepted for this session. Overall, we had 11 presentations in total. 8 of them were poster presentations, and 3 of them were video presentations. And just like others have done in previous sessions, we grouped these presentations in according to the main discussions in the content. We had most of the presentations from Asia and Europe, with one each from the US and Australia. Like I said, we grouped them according to the main content. And so we had 4 presentations that drew from the lessons that we got from the interactions between experts and residents of the Fukushima, following the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident. We also had 2 posters which talked about the challenges of communication, 3 presentations which talked on the recommendations that we can use to enhance communication and radiological protection, and 2 more posters on some of the innovations that they leveraged to communicate better in their community. Now, the first on the lessons from Fukushima was reported by Kyung-Yum Kim from the Korea Atomic Research Institute, and they basically described the increased concern that the Korean community had following the report by IAEA, a comprehensive report on the release of treated water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And they described the strategies that they used to allay those fears in the Korean public. And at the end of it, they made a report on the successes they achieved and the recommendations for the roles of the media and the government in achieving that. Also, on the lessons from Fukushima, Hiroyuki Tori from the University of Tokyo analyzed some tweets, and by the way, Twitter is no longer called Twitter, it's called X. And I just realized that tweets are no longer tweets, but called posts. So from millions of posts following the nuclear power plant accident, they analyzed a methodically selected few and saw what people were reacting to and made recommendations on how best scientists can effectively convey their technical evidence to the public. There were a couple of other posters based on the lessons from Fukushima from Kazuto Uno and Motoko Kosugi. Kazuko Uno reported on the importance of fact-checking of Twitter content to prevent prolonged health-related consequences caused by the radiation anxiety in Fukushima. And Motoko basically compared the mental models of both the experts and the residents and reported on the discrepancy between the two. Now, on challenges with communication, there's this interesting report from the Czech Republic by Václav Matejka, and it talks about the gray zone, the so-called gray areas of communicating risk, especially in specific cases. And he really highlighted that using the case of a radioactive mineral collector who had tens of kilograms of those materials in his household because he believed that it conveyed some kind of spiritual advantage. And when local law enforcement discovered it, they, on their own, assumed it was a radiological emergency and called in the nuclear regulator for assessment. And when it was assessed, the regulator found out that the conservative dose estimate was just about 10 millisievert per year. And then a lot of questions arose. In this particular case, the law enforcement was asking, is this really qualified for us to say it's a radiological emergency exposure situation? And a lot of questions like that came up. So how does the regulator communicate effectively to law enforcement who were, in this case, desiring to prosecute this person on what really it means for us to say that the situation is an emergency exposure situation? At the end of the day, they made a recommendation to suggest a dose level that we can say that harm is caused. Also, Colin Walsh gave a really interesting presentation on communication, on the debate on both sides of risk estimate from low-dose diagnostic exposures. And at the end, he really gave two interesting quotes that could be adopted when communicating risk from low-dose diagnostic exposures. So I would encourage us to check out the poster and see what those quotes are. There was also a presentation from David Sibinele of the Australian Radiological Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency on their experience on countering radiation misinformation in Australia. And he really gave interesting strategies that they used. I found this Talk to a Scientist phone-in platform really interesting. And at the end of the day, he also presented the results that they received from implementing these strategies, which included fewer phone calls from the public because they're already informed. And those that were now asking questions were now asking more educated questions. And also, he described the effect that had when there was a missing source in January in Western Australia. Also on recommendations, Luo Jin really gave an interesting example of on what he called the not in my backyard effect. So not in my backyard is for people who don't want anything radiation or nuclear to be sited near their vicinity because of perceived risk to their health. And he gave an interesting discussion on the public communication and how they counter that using a specific project on proton therapy system construction. Also, we have another presentation from Leva from Lithuania, where they gave recommendations based on their experience there on the importance of communication in the case of a radiological emergency. And finally, on innovations of communication, we had two interesting presentations. One was a poster, one was a video on some technologies that were leveraged on to really improve on communication and radiological protection. Geraldine from the US reported on the use of a clinical decision support tool, as well as AI tool. The popular one we know is ChatGPT, on how that can help to advance medical imaging and safeguards that can be implemented. Sana van Balen from the UK also described how they are developing a game to help with educating the public on the use of potassium iodide tablets. In conclusion, there are so many things to take away from these 11 posters. I would highlight on just 3 of them. The main thrust of their presentations showed that engaging the media, both social media and traditional media, as well as media professionals, can really go a long way in helping to counter misinformation when communicating in radiological protection. The second point to note is we as experts, we have to keep innovating on how best we can communicate our science to the public in a way that will make them understand that science as closely as possible as we do. And finally, we need to keep an eye out on emerging technologies that can help us achieve this goal. And with that, I want to thank you for listening and to remind you that you can access all these posters on the poster portal. Thank you.
Thank you, McLean. Well, our first speaker is Jacques Rochard of the Nagasaki University. He will present on the Fukushima dialogue and its communication. Please.
Can I just add one little point? Many of you know Jacques and know that he has been a member of the ICRP for a long time and its vice chairman for a couple of years. And just a few days ago, the main commission decided that he will be an emeritus member of the main commission from now on. So congratulations to that.
Thank you, Frido, for your kind words. Minasan konnichiwa. Hello to all of you. I will present briefly the Fukushima dialogue and what lessons could be drawn from this dialogue for to improve risk communication. The story about the dialogue started in Belarus in the mid-90s and early 2000s as part of the Ethos project and then the core program. It started with small meetings with the local farmers in 97 and 96, 97 and so on. And then we enlarged this type of meetings. The objective was to listen to the people, to the stakeholders, the local stakeholders, because we didn't know very much about Belarus. We had a lot of science in our head, but how people were living, what were their concerns, what were the problems they were facing, we had to learn. And then, of course, we enlarged this approach when we decided about the core program a few years later. And it was always the same way of doing things, listening basically to people, trying to understand their concerns, their expectations. What are the characteristics of the Fukushima dialogue? Because the topic is Fukushima dialogue. So far, there were 25 dialogue meetings. First, initiated and organized by ICRP, based on the Belarus experience. Then they were continued by a group of local stakeholders with the support of ICRP. And finally, they are in the hands of the NPO Fukushima dialogue since 2021. So the dialogue is now in the hands of the local people of Fukushima. A large spectrum of topics covering all aspects of the post-accident situation have been covered by the dialogue. There was for each dialogue an extensive preparation work. Facilitation work was based on 20 years of experience using the IDPA facilitating method to ensure the fairness of the process. I will come back in my conclusion of the NPO Fukushima dialogue and give you some reference there, and also the IDPA facilitating method, but it's not the topic of my presentation. This was only possible because we received financial support from IRSN, NRPA, CPN, the Nippon Foundation, and many donors now. We had outstanding translators because, you know, when you are listening to the testimonies of local people, you need to have very, very good translators to give all the nuances which are extremely important. And roughly, we can estimate that altogether more than 600 individuals participated, different individuals participated to the 25 dialogues. So that was the first dialogue in Fukushima in November 2011, thanks to Niwa Sensei. I think Niwa is probably in this room, and Kai Sensei, who visited Belarus a few weeks before and decided that we should develop with ICRP the same approach of listening to people. Just some faces of the dialogues. You know, dialogues are basically events with people, and I want to show these people. But there were, of course, a lot of Fukushima people, local people, professionals, but there were also a few testimonies from Belarus. You recognize probably Professor Bogdevich from Belarus. You recognize on the second line, you have Astrid Leland from Norway. And there were, from time to time, but very rarely, a presentation from ICRP. And you see Niwa Sensei in the 13th dialogue. What were the characteristics of the Fukushima dialogue? To continue, they are based on facts. I think we were relying on good science to answer to some questions, if there were questions. But we also heavily relied on ethical values. Mutual respect and fairness were the basis. Empathy, inclusivity, transparency, openness, that was all that was applied during this dialogue. We were giving priority to storytelling, focusing on attentive listening. I mean, that was the key issue for experts, to listen carefully to what was said by the stakeholders. Highlighting the diversity of point of view and not imposing anything and letting everyone make their own mind. We were not giving any recommendations. Despite it was organized by ICRP, we were not trying to convince people about the good principles of ICRP and the limits of ICRP. We were not at all imposing anything. How were the structures, the structure of the dialogue meetings? They evolved first, during the first period, 2011-2015, until this was a combination of 2 half days of testimonies to share experience and 2 half days of facilitated dialogues using the IDPA method to facilitate the expression of concerns, expectations, and the diversity of points of view. So the first morning we had testimonies, in the afternoon what we call the facilitated dialogue or structured dialogue, and then the second day, once again, testimonies in the morning and dialogue in the afternoon. Then from the 16th dialogue to now, and this was a request from the Fukushima people, but it was corresponding also to the fact that there was the lifting of the evacuation orders and that people were allowed to return in some municipalities. And of course, it was interesting to visit these municipalities and to try to understand the problems the people returning were facing. So from the 60th dialogue, it was 1 day local visit and 1 day of testimonies, 1 half day of testimonies in the morning, in the second day, and 1 half day of facilitated dialogue. You know, some local visits, just to give you a flavor. For example, we visited the devastated dwelling by wild boars in Futaba. We visited a cattle farm in Fukushima City. We visited the reconstructed Izanohama Harbor. It was in 2019. And also the Yamakiya temporary storage site. You know, this was visits commented, and these visits were the opportunity to have a lot of exchange with the local people and explaining once again their concerns, how they see the future, and so on and so on. There were also sometimes some performances, because I think the cultural dimension, the traditional dimension of the life in Fukushima is extremely important. So you see, for example, the Yosushi dancers, the Tominari drummers. Drummers are very famous in Fukushima. There were sometimes some participants who would try to make some nice music, like a journalist, Omori-san, and a professor of radiology, Miyazaki-san. They were playing for us. And then we had also the Obara drummers. Drummers are, as I said, are important in Fukushima. What is the role of dialogue between experts and the affected people? First of all, it brings together various skills and sensibilities and helps to identify the real concern and expectations of people. The dialogue is abolishing the duality between experts and laymen, those who know and those who don't know. This is extremely important. This is why we speak also from co-expertise, because we consider that stakeholders are experts as the experts are experts in science. The stakeholders are experts of their daily life, of the life in their community, and they know the tradition and so on, and experts don't know. It is a space to share freely and openly experiences, and for everyone to listen to different viewpoints and opinions on the situation, and put himself in the shoes of others. You know, the IDPA method is basically a method to force people to speak, to offer people to say something with the same time, and also to listen to the others, and to be able to comment about what the others have said. It's a very interesting approach. Of course, we use the common language and narratives to facilitate the sharing of each person's intimate experience, the revelation of the richness of sense of the situation, and also allows each one to revisit their values and aspirations and affirm their identity. The diversity of views of the participants facilitate understanding the complexity of the situation they face and facilitate the search for solutions. We were not looking for solutions to problems. We were looking for understanding the problem and trying to find, as much as possible, some sort of compromise on the way to look at the situation. Why to implement dialogue meetings? Two-way communication is very important, but mainly focused on facts, figures, and this is not enough. This is what we learned with time in Belarus and in Fukushima. Experts must recognize that affected people have stories to tell, to know themselves, first of all, and be recognized by the others. This is for a lay person to be able to express her or his view in front of neighbors and also in front of experts is a very challenging process, but also very good, very rewarding process. It's not, for experts, it's not just to provide information. Even if this is done with in the framework of two-way communication. You know that in risk communication nowadays, one-way communication is almost abandoned. I think we try to discuss with with the people. But even in this case, risk communication is sometimes a little bit limited. By telling stories, by recounting the breakdown of the unity of their lives, those who are affected give meaning to what is happening to them and situate themselves in relation to their personal situation, including the risk they face. This is a real important aspect. Why to implement dialogue meetings? To continue, the objective is not to refuse science, not at all, but to rebalance exchanges between affected people and experts so that communication is fairer and more effective. As the accident calls into question or even modifies the social identity of the affected people, their places of life and their habits, by telling their stories, affected people gradually regain their self-esteem and ultimately their ability to act. This is the key, to empower people, to help them to understand the situation, to empower them so that they are not ashamed anymore, that they regain self-esteem. Images and metaphors used by stakeholders in telling stories are very powerful ways of seeing oneself and expressing their own relationship to others and the world around them. You know, if you ask lay people to talk about their experience, their day-to-day life, their problems, they often use images and metaphors because this is the way to approach the world for them. Why dialogue should be part of risk communication? By mainly focusing on the risk, exchanges between experts and affected people are tending to become impersonal, to encourage withdrawal into oneself and promote distrust. The objective of the dialogue is to establish a relationship between the people concerned and the experts based on empathy and attentive listening so that people do not feel objectified. That was a remark from Niwa Sensei at the beginning of the dialogue, you know, when he said, people are subjects, not objects. It is also to help experts to think about their practice. This is a very important point. You know, it's not only about the stakeholders, it's about also the experts. To think about their practice and to question the meaning of the concerns and expectations of the affected people, taking into account the prevailing circumstances. When sometimes lay people are proposing something which at first glance is even not valid scientifically or is very naive, the problem is not to say, this is not like this. The problem is why this person is telling that. What is the reason this person looks at the situation like she or he does? I come now to my concluding remarks. Classic risk communication must be supplemented by the involvement of stakeholders in dialogues to empower them and restore their dignity. Because what is at stake, finally, with a nuclear accident is the dignity of people. The lessons of the Fukushima dialogue should certainly be applied to exposure situations other than post-accident ones. I think this is something to explore at the ICRP level. However, there is a significant need to train experts so that they develop their empathy skills and also master the facilitation method essential to the success of dialogue with stakeholders. This is what I try to do with my students in Nagasaki University. And I finished this presentation with my favorite motto, dialogue. It's working with people and not for them. And you have to meditate that. These dialogues were relatively successful so far. And we were even rewarded by the Ministry of Environment and the Fukushima Prefectural Government in February 2018. My dear colleague Chris Clement, we received letters of appreciation. It was a real unexpected move from our Japanese colleagues, but it was very important for us. And finally, I'd like to introduce briefly the so-called IDPA method that I mentioned twice, the identification, diagnosis, prospective, and action method that we have used without saying we were applying a method, but we have used this method during all dialogues. And we just published an article on this method with my PhD student, Win Tuzar, Kai Sensei, who is sitting on the front row here, and Ando-san from NPO Fukushima Dialogue. And I invite you to read this paper, and you will understand much better what was at stake with this method, which is, and we give as an example the dialogue. I want also to finish my presentation by mentioning the NPO Fukushima Dialogue website. You will find a lot of interesting information on this site, and this site will evolve in the coming months, and we expect that there will be a time where all the dialogues, which are recorded, of course, each dialogue is video recorded, and you can find all the material on this website. This is very easy to find. I think this is Fukushima-dialogue.gp or something like that. It's very easy to find. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jax. Okay. Well, I think some of you have some questions and comments, but please wait a while. We accept all the questions, comments after all the presentations done. So we'll have the second presentation on the role of effective communication and stakeholder engagement in application of the system protection. The presentation will be done by Peter Bryant. Please.
はじめまして、私は Bryant Peter です。どうぞよろしく。Thank you for inviting me here today to give a talk. So my day job is as Head of Environment, Decommissioning and Radiation Safety at Sizewell C, which is a new nuclear power station in the UK. But today I'm here to present to you on behalf of the World Nuclear Association. So for those of you that might not know who WNA is, we're the international organization representing the global civil nuclear power industry. The mission of WNA is to promote a wider understanding of nuclear energy among key international influencers by producing authoritative information, developing common industry positions, and contributing to the energy debate. And what's really important is the membership of WNA actually includes the entire nuclear fuel cycle. And it's also a special liaison organization to the ICRP as well. Now, back in September, WNA had the pleasure of hosting the ICRP Special Liaisons Organization meeting in Bristol, which is a great city if you haven't been, really, really good for its cider. And we also decided at the same time to host a collaborative 2-day workshop. Now, in this 2-day workshop, we covered 2 separate themes, 1 day per theme. The first was on optimization of the system of radiological protection based on an all hazards approach, which my colleague Marcel Lips will talk about tomorrow. And the second one was on effective communication and stakeholder engagement in the system of radiological protection. Now, the aims of these workshops, because there have been similar workshops like this in the past, was actually to bring the practitioner's views. We actually only wanted to talk about real case studies that existed. We had 80 attendees from across the globe, and just to say it was open, anyone could attend and register to attend. And attendees came from the UK, probably not surprising it being hosted there, Europe, so France, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, Czech Republic, Finland and Italy, Japan, Canada, Australia, South Korea and the US. So a really good selection of attendees made it to the workshop. And to give you an idea of the attendance breakdown, we had people from the mining sector, fuel fabrication, new nuclear build, operating nuclear power stations, decommissioning, waste management, including geological disposal, defence nuclear, along with a wide range of other organisations such as academia and research, public bodies, regulators and the supply chain. So importantly, it had the entire nuclear fuel cycle there, and we were all just there to give practical examples of the challenges we have faced and how we tackled them. The presented case studies throughout the day covered a range of topics from emergency response. So we had a couple of talks from members from Japan on Fukushima Daiichi, but we also had different perspectives. So how did member states or other countries deal with a response in relation to the accident as well? We had representatives from the mining industry giving talks, enrichment facilities giving talks, new nuclear build giving talks, decommissioning and waste management, research reactors in an education and research area, and a really fascinating talk on artificial intelligence, which I believe the actual speaker of that is in the audience. So before I go into actually the feedback of what we discovered, and apologies for those of you that have seen me do this example before, I want to do a little bit of a wake me up for everyone, because it's after lunch, I can see people starting to feel full, they start to fall asleep. So I just want one very simple action from everyone. Think about the 3 following activities, okay? Skydiving, going on a night out in Tokyo drinking hoppy. For those of you that don't know what that is, that's where you use a very light non-alcoholic beer, but you mix it with alcohol. So you pour how much alcohol you want in, you top it with beer. And it's amazing to see when people say stop with the alcohol and then add the tiny amount of non-alcoholic beer on top. And then lastly, it's commuting to work in a city such as London via bike. So if I can just ask, as I read out each of those examples, stand up when you think that's the one that's going to give you the greatest risk of serious injury. So who in the audience thinks skydiving is going to give you the greatest risk of serious injury? I really hope, there's at least one person stands up. Who thinks going on a night out drinking hoppy is going to give you the worst case of serious injury? Okay, a couple of other people now standing up. So does that mean, and I hope everyone else now stands up to stretch your legs, that everyone thinks commuting to work, such as in a city such as London, gives the greatest risk of injury? Okay, quite, okay. So actually, in reality, the risk is broadly equivalent in all of those cases, right? But what that exercise simply teaches us is we all have a different perception of risk, okay? A perception of risk is a personal held belief of what we physically believe is dangerous and what's not. And that actually can lead to genuine fear or concerns. And those genuine fears and concerns are genuine. We should treat them with respect. That's a personal fear that someone might have. I can say that as radiation protection professionals and scientists, we decided to test option 2 last night. And so here is a photo of a couple of us drinking hoppy. And I can say, I can safely confirm that no one returned with serious injury, at least nothing visible. So where does this concern come from? Okay, what was the kind of feedback we were getting from this workshop about where this concerns or difference in perception of risk can come from? And there's probably 2 core areas it can come from. We can't shy away from history, okay? We need to own that. Even as an industry, we need to own it. There have been incidents in the past. We talk about Fukushima Daiichi. We talk about, obviously, Chernobyl. And those are genuine examples of history that people know about, and that's going to affect their perception. But the other piece is misinformation. So I just want people to, and this is the last time I'm going to ask for audience participation. How many of you in the room, when you do not know the answer to something, will pick up your phone and Google the answer? Raise your hand. I think some people aren't being very honest. I think it's more than half the room. How many of you fact check it? Fact check what you read? Probably very few of us, but some of us might do a couple of checks. So let's test this theory. If you Google around environmental impacts and nuclear power stations, 2 articles come up. BBC News. Chernobyl zone shows a decline in biodiversity. The Telegraph. 30 years after Chernobyl disaster, wildlife is flourishing in a radioactive wasteland. 2 contradictory statements. I mean, even the second one sounds negative, although it's trying to be positive as well. But 2 contradictory statements. Who is the public to believe when everything they see contradicts? Okay? Creates confusion, creates area where people don't know what the truth is, and negative or fearful responses can be much more dominating as an emotion. So that was theme 1 that came out of the workshop. Recognize we all have our own individual perception of risk, and that it is people's belief, and we need to treat that with respect when people have genuine fear and concern. Theme number 2, who are your stakeholders? So one thing that came very, very, very clear in the workshop is everyone treated who a stakeholder was differently. And actually, having just come last week from the Australasian Radiation Protection Society conference, I actually think there was a really great observation that someone raised when they talked about the communication they'd be having with the Aboriginal community. And they said they didn't like the word stakeholder, because stakeholder is quite cold. And so they were proposing change it to relationships. This isn't about stakeholders. This is about who are you building relationships with, okay? So to give you some examples of the types of relationships people were talking about, they were talking about relationships with politicians who might want to communicate a message, shareholders or investors in a business, higher management, your workers, your operators, your supply chain, your regulators, your member states, your local community, and your wider public. All of these different parties were referenced in the workshop. And what's really important here is this isn't all the different stakeholders you can get, and there can be subcategories. Who are the public? Are we talking about school children? Are we talking about parents? Are we talking about patients? Are we talking about local residents? So know who your stakeholders are was a definite theme that came through. And then the third theme, why are we communicating? Now, one thing, and especially those of you that have gone to communication workshops before, one theme always comes through: build trust with your stakeholders, okay? But then there were a couple of other things that came along out of this as well. Coming back to my earlier point, it's enabling people to make their own informed decision, as ultimately individuals will decide for themselves if they feel safe. The important message here is it is not our job or our role to tell people something is safe. It's to allow them to make their own informed decision. It's ensure people feel informed to decide on what actions they wish to take, such as adopting appropriate countermeasures when required. And the last part is meeting people's needs of being given clear communication and instruction while feeling informed and engaged rather than being passive victims. And I think that comes very much back to what Jack was just talking about as well. But I'll emphasize the point there on clear. And just sitting this morning listening to the talks, I wonder, how would we communicate some of those talks to the public? Very complex topics. Do we need to? And the last theme that came through was the importance of a communication strategy and plan. Now, when we talked about this, it's not just about using it in an emergency, because we already know very much emergency planning, we should have good communication strategies, but actually for other scenarios, such as new nuclear builds, geological waste repositories, we know all of these ones here would benefit from having a clear communication plan. Importantly, this must cover your entire communication timeline, from any pre-engagement, implementation of communication, and beyond. It covers the entire timeline of what you're communicating. It needs to identify all your stakeholders or relationships early on, and you might need to keep adapting that list. It might grow. One of the most important points should be informed by stakeholder engagement to determine their needs. I'll say it again, it is not our job to tell people something is safe. It's for us to help inform people, but we should be informing them about what do they want to know. It's not us saying, what do we think you need to know? It's what do people want to know? You need to determine your communication methods. Now, having worked in 2 nuclear build projects and having been put in some very awkward positions when things go wrong, I will say one thing here. We as radiation protection professionals do not need to reinvent communication science. This science has existed for a long time. We need to be engaging communication experts. So do not underestimate the power of engaging with communication experts to shape your messages and determine your optimum way of communicating. And lastly, you may need to think about methods for measuring your impact. So let's just go into a quick example. So I said I'm from Sizewell C. So for those of you who don't know what Sizewell C is, it's a new nuclear power station in the UK. It's 2 EPR, so pressurized water reactor units, and all the associated fuel management and waste management facilities on one site. So we've engaged the community for over 10 years, and last year we successfully achieved a decision on our planning application, giving us the go-ahead for the project. What's important here, though, is we took a lot of lessons from our first NeoBuild project of what we didn't get right and how we communicated, and we were able to apply that to our second project. And the most important point was engaging early and listening. So it didn't mean we engaged them after we put in an application to build there. It meant we built the relationships prior to even submitting our planning application. And so what we did was we spoke to them over 10 years. We even got an independent body involved to deal with the communication so that anything that was said would automatically be fed back, communicated, and be open and transparent about. So we're always going to say everything of what's being said in those dialogues. So every year, they sent out a survey. And this survey was sent out from postal to online via apps that could be used to respond to it. We advertised it on social media, so everyone had an opportunity to respond and to different demographics. And importantly is, do not focus just on radiation. You want to know what everyone wants to know about all the different parameters. Radiation is just one part of what you might need to communicate on. So this is one of the questions we've asked every single year. What do you think are the benefits from the potential development of the new nuclear power station at Sizewell? And what's been a massive theme throughout has always been jobs and training opportunities, but in the more recent years, energy independence has been really important. So it's important to recognize you want to see what people want to know about from a positive point of view, as well as from a negative point of view. So what are people being concerned about in relation to this new nuclear power station? Interestingly, the biggest one isn't radiation. It was impact to the environment and wildlife. So Sizewell is being built in a very ecologically sensitive area. So it probably isn't too surprising given where it is, but the biggest concern from the local public is all around the impact on the environment and the wildlife. And then number 2 is safety, and number 3 was radioactive waste management. Now what this allowed us to do is know exactly what areas to target communication in and have further conversations on. So what we started doing was going, you know what, let's bring in communication specialists. So on the topic of radioactive waste, we actually got together some people we thought were pretty good public communicators in the area of radiation protection and radioactive waste management. So we had Professor Mike Wood from the University of Salford, Professor Jerry Thomas from Imperial College, and Professor Paddy Regan from the University of Surrey, and then the interloper myself was in there as well. And we spent 3 to 6 hours each being filmed by a media crew, and then 2 minutes of those conversations were used in a video. Tell you what, 6 hours, back to back, no break, that was quite intense. But they took what were the key messages and they managed to turn it into something readily understandable. And we actually used those videos then to help communicate with people who might just want some information. And then along that, we did two-way dialogues with certain groups and those interested parties. And then the other part, which is something which might make people feel uncomfortable about in the room, because from a nuclear industry perspective, we have never been particularly good about this, is you are always going to have people who are going to then take things to the press, or you're going to get press stories. So this is an example of an article that was written in the local regional paper for around where Sizewell was being built. Will Sizewell C be obsolete before completion? And then it talks about the world is now alerted to the impossible task of effectively dealing with waste uranium isotopes that remain hazardous to all forms of life for over 1,000 years. EDF are planning to store this hazardous waste on the Sizewell beach, and I believe the waste in the reactor could eventually go into the sea. Okay. Now, what normally used to happen, and I'll say this what we did at our previous project, is we would not respond to this. Okay, we would just leave it be there. But if you do not respond and do not get involved in the two-way dialogue, what happens is misinformation promulgates. So we need to be braver in responding to this. And it doesn't mean we get into an argument. We get into a factual discussion, but in a really readily easy to understand way, which is what we did. So we put in a counter-argument and a counter-article. And again, we weren't aggressive in it. We just tried to make sure there were two sides to a story being out there so people would always see two parts to it. So we see here we talk about the robust shielding that's in place that protects and reduces the radiation. And we try and put it into context saying that the additional radiation exposure to a member of public living near Sizewell C's waste stores when filled will be 1,000 times less than what you get from natural background and less than that from drinking a cup of coffee a day. Okay, but it's an example about don't be afraid to get involved in the two-way dialogue. We shouldn't run away or fear the conversation. So what I want to leave you therefore with is just a couple of kind of remarks. Well, first things first, Sizewell C, they said, we've been monitoring the data for 10 years about what happens in various ways, about different political things happening, what does support to the project do, what do people want to know. And one interesting trend that consistently went up and down with each other as a function of time were two questions. What happens the more open and transparent you are, and what happens in terms of the support for a development? When we started, people thought we were about 37% open. It then went up to about 2 years ago to 57%. Support for the project kept going up as well. The more open you are and people actually believing you're being open and honest, the greater the trust will be and support will be. And so lastly, I'm going to leave you with a couple of quotes from the workshops, which I thought were particularly great, and also just a couple of concluding remarks. So, quotes of the workshop. The first one came from Mike Lavelle, who's an ex-nuclear operator, but he was employed as an advisor to the UK government during the incident at Fukushima Daiichi to see what they needed to do from a UK side. He said, surprising things happen, be prepared. Wise words. The second one from someone in the room, Jim Hondris at the back, who was talking about the mining side. Do not lecture, but do listen. Very wise words. And then the third set of quotes came from Ben Gagan. So Ben actually isn't a radiation protection professional. He's an ex-BBC journalist and national BBC anchor presenter, so on the news a lot. And he said, complexity, science and engineering do not work for communication. Except you cannot persuade everyone. 2 words of wisdom. Don't always focus on the science. You need things to be understandable. You don't want to alienate your audience. And then Joseph Zick from Canada, in relation to McMaster's University, spoke about his work on some of the facilities they were building and said, be the first to communicate. Don't wait for others to communicate first. Be the first to communicate. And so I'll leave you with 3 concluding remarks. Firstly, as I've said it before, I'll say it again, your decision on what is safe is a personal decision. It's our role to help people based that on real risk and not perceived risk. And this links really to what I was saying about this morning as well. It's important to really note that as well as the system of radiation protection having a sound basis in science and ethics, it must be readily understandable and have internal consistency, which makes it believable to the community of users, but also the public as well. Okay? It's really important you can communicate it. And then lastly, 2 final points. The key is the need to plan and replan, okay? It's not something you write a plan on and then you throw it away after. You have to keep replanning. So think about communication strategies and plans. And lastly, we all need to work together. And that means ICRP, academia, practitioners, and communication specialists. Let's not reinvent the science here in terms of how we want to tackle this. And on that last note, I'd just say, obviously, WNA is very, very pleased to have hosted that workshop. We're more than happy to host follow-on workshops with ICRP and other organisations, and we are committed to this being a long-term relationship in finding a more effective way to communicate as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much. It's amazing how punctual our speakers are. Within a few seconds, 20 minutes. Great. Our third speaker is Tommi Toivonen from Finland. He's representing HERCA. HERCA is an organization of the heads of the European Radiological Protection Competent Authorities. And this is your presentation on HERCA's perspectives on the challenges of the communication in radiation protection. Thank you.
Thank you, chairs. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I work usually for the Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority in Finland, but as presented, now I have another hat on, as I am representing HERCA. And here are some key figures of HERCA. We are an association of radiation protection authorities. 32 countries in Europe, so it's the whole European Union plus Switzerland, Norway, and the UK. Altogether 55 authorities. chair is now in France, Jean-Luc Lachaume from ASN. And let's move forward. I would like to, we are the regulators, so I would like to bring a few other viewpoints to this discussion. We are the ones who implement the system of radiological protection, and we have studied what our members feel about the system of radiological protection. Communication was one of the main points in there. So I will represent some of the results, but first I would like to share with you a few thoughts about communication in general. First of all, why is it important? I would say that if we fail in communicating, we fail in radiation protection. And this might seem to be a little bit too much to say, but the previous presenters showed us very good data on why is it important, and I will just give you a few examples more to justify this statement. First of all, as a regulator, I must say that in the national level we don't follow the recommendations by ICRP or even IEAE. We follow the national law. And in that sense, the most important stakeholder for us are the decision makers, basically the politicians. They are non-experts in radiation protection, and they may decide who they listen to. If we think it is a good idea to base our laws in science and in international regulations, we have to be able to communicate that. In such processes, there are always lots of other stakeholders involved. For example, the industry, there are the labor unions, through the open consultation also the activists. And if we fail to communicate the reasons why the legislation should be based on science, the decision makers will listen to somebody else instead of us. I give you another example why is it very important to communicate in radiation protection. Emergency responses were discussed very truly in the previous speeches, but if you think about the first response in, let's say, a fairly big accident involving radiation, the message from our side would be something like, go home, close windows, stay inside. Right. I think that's a good response for many situations involving like radioactive fallout. If we have earned our trust and we are good in communicating, that's what people will do. But if we fail, they will go to social media and immediately they will jump into the cars and try to drive us as far away as they can until they stuck in traffic jam, are unable to seek shelter, and also blocks the roads for the authorities. So it's all about communications. Will these strategies work? And as a third example, I still bring up the fact that radiation causes anxiety, and that might be a very difficult thing from the point of view of quality of life of the affected individuals. And we have a responsibility to give the good knowledge, unbiased information, so that as few people as possible go in there. So there are 3 examples of why communications is very important, and I would like to stress out that this communication is not only something that happens between the authorities and the general public. There are other very significant stakeholders as well, and also they are not only related to emergency situations. There's also just the everyday work we do. Then let's move forward to the next statement. Communication is difficult. I think that most of you who have tried will agree with me. Communication is difficult, especially when it comes to radiation. There were lots of good examples in the previous two presentations about this, but I will still give you one more. Communication is always something that's happening between the people. It's two-way, and there's always people involved. In one side of the table, there are us, the regulators, the radiation safety experts, but who are on the other side of the table? The problem is that there's everybody. Basically, we have the general public. That's not one single group of people, that's several groups of people. The decision makers, they are not a single group either. Then one of the most important stakeholders, again, the operators of the radiation practices or the nuclear power plants. They are not just single group. They are small business, one-man business, up to very big business, high expertise or no expertise. They might focus on radiation or they just have one measurement device, and it's far from their core business. So the communication is inevitably difficult when we have such a large group of people on the other side of the table. Then the third question, what can be done to improve this? We had lots of good examples again in the previous presentations. Keep them in mind. But this is also a place where HERCA can come into picture. We have lots of experience in implementing the system of radiological protection. So we actually did a questionnaire 3 years ago and revisited that last year. So quite recent information about how these 32 countries and 55 authorities feel about the need to develop the system of radiological protection. And one of maybe 4 main topics in that report were communication. The report, actually the name of the report is seen there, reflections and so on. And you can find it from the HERCA open website, so please feel free to download it and read the whole paper. But I'm now representing a few findings concerning especially the communication. There are actually 3 points. First one, that we found out that the system of radiation protection is perceived quite complex, or actually even very complex. Based on what I said a few moments ago, senior experts or even mid-career experts can understand it, but that's not enough. We also have to be able to explain it to non-experts, to the decision makers, to the general public, to anyone who's involved. So we feel that some simplification could actually improve the effectiveness of the system as a whole. Of course, this is maybe not just about changing the system of radiological protection. There are always many measures that can be taken. For example, the lessons learned from Fukushima we have heard today in the earlier presentations. Lots of ways to improve communications, but our point of view was how the system of radiological protection supports our tasks. The second finding is that the radiation risk should be seen in the context of other risks. In other words, as a one risk among other risks there are. It is often so that radiation is perceived a little bit more dangerous than some other risks that are even dangerous or even worse risks. that might lead to overregulation, at least in the national level, maybe not in the ICRP level, but again, when we go to the level of national regulations, there might be overregulation because the decision makers think radiation is more dangerous than it is. Also, there are examples where radiation is not perceived as dangerous as it should be. From my country, I could say two examples. They are indoor radon and ultraviolet exposure. They are the biggest killers in Finland when it comes to radiation. Together, more than 500 Finns die each year because of these types of radiation. And it seems that, for example, decision makers don't put that much effort to these risks as compared to radiation practices, for example, which basically I would say kill 0 people per year. So the clear communication on the level of risk is needed. I don't have good answers how can it be made. We had in the previous presentations some good ideas, and also in our questionnaire it was often thought that it's good to compare radiation to the background. Everyone's exposed a few millisievert a year. That's a good starting point to tell people how dangerous it is it to have, let's say, 10 microsieverts in addition. But that's a difficult task, and I think this is something that scientific community should elaborate further. Then the final one, transparency in uncertainties. Many of the responses we got thought that the uncertainties are not actually very transparently communicated when it comes to the system of radiological protection. We all know, as we are experts in radiation protection, that there are uncertainties in science. For example, low doses, the overall health detriment, the dosimetry might be very difficult sometimes, there are uncertainties. And even if there are uncertainties, we have to take action, so we use prudence or precautionary approach to take action even if there are uncertainties. But these should be clearly stated when there is scientific evidence, when are we taking action in sort of a political decision, how much risk would we like to accept. This is true also for the safety measures. There are very much uncertainties in what is the best safety measure for a given situation. It's very easy to say what's the net benefit of certain safety measure we do, but it's easy only afterwards, not when the situation is on. That's a combination of many factors. We can't know what's the best way, as we know that also safety measures are usually to some extent harmful. So, transparency, when we know something, when we don't know something, when the actions are based on precaution. If the uncertainties are not communicated very well, it might lead to a situation that we all know that happens, that the first level increases some level of conservatism, then the next level adds some conservatism on top of the previous one. Third step adds still some conservatism, and we end up having a very conservative system. Okay, these were my 3 points. I seem to have no slide to sum up, but I will sum up anyway. First of all, communication is an integral part of radiation protection. I hope you agree with me on that. HERCA feels that the system of radiological protection is robust, scientifically solid, and fit for purpose. And as regulators, the last thing we would like to see is sudden changes in a system that has been developed during several decades. However, we see some room for development or evolution in the system of radiological protection, and HERCA is more than happy to participate and partner ICRP and other stakeholders in order to help ICRP to continue its important work. Thank you very much, audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for leaving some time for our discussion. We have about 20 minutes. Can I ask you, whoever would like to ask a question, make a comment, to introduce yourself, say your name and where you come from, and also who you want to address of our speakers, if you have a particular question to one of the speakers, or you just make a general comment. So the first speaker is already on the way to the microphone.
Thank you. Abel Gonzalez from Argentina. Well, we thank you very much for 3 important presentations on communication. What I miss is some reference to miscommunication. Miscommunication to a good intention, to intention to alleviate tension, for instance. And I would refer to one example that was rather successful. All of you know that in addition to Chernobyl and Fukushima, there was an important accident in Europe that was a wind scale, which has an enormous impact in many parts of Europe. And the solution of communication of wind scale was very good. They changed the name. Wind scale was changed to Sellafield. Of course, for the local people, this was was clear that was not a difference. But for the rest of the world, it's unbelievable the success that it has had. I check with many people in my profession. I talk about the wind scale accident, and they have not a clue that wind scale was in Sellafield. And nobody associates Sellafield with the wind scale accident. And I found this an interesting example of miscommunication, which was not used in any other part. Fukushima could have been changed to Iwaki, for instance, and we will talk now about Iwaki and not about Fukushima. But I would like to hear your reflections on this miscommunication. And not that I am proposing miscommunication, but to have some reflection on miscommunication.
Thank you. Would any of the speakers like to address this point?
I'll go for it first. It's an interesting example, isn't it? And it actually reminds me of a delivery company in the UK that also changed its name. I think we've got to accept where communication was then versus where communication is now. So the way we communicate has rapidly changed over periods of time. You've got to also accept that the way that communication worked back in the day of wind scales is very different to now. Information can get out to people much quicker via things like social media. I think back to an example we had in a sister project on Hinkley Point C. It took literally a matter of hours for a negative story to gain traction around the whole world. So information can travel really quickly now. But importantly, there's something about being open, honest, and transparent which gives you trust. And if you don't do that, it's only going to take a matter of time before someone calls you out on not being honest, and then the trust is gone. This is about having an enduring long-term relationship with parties, and therefore you do need to be open, honest about everything you're doing, because trust can be lost in a moment.
Thank you. Would you like to say something? I think the speaker there he was first? Okay, good.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Dr. Pradeep Kumar from India, and I had the experience of working in nuclear reactors and was the emergency response manager for the one and only radiological emergency which happened in India. So dealing with the public, I appreciate the views of communication especially by the experts to the member of the public. But I want to address what are the challenges involved, and I want to add into it. See, as far as member of the public is concerned, for him, whether you tell 1 out of 10,000 or 1 out of 1 lakh, he asks a question, how I can be sure that I am not that one? This is the main issue. Second is, they ask the question, because media today publishes, we strongly hold to our heart the linear no threshold hypothesis, and the media says even the smallest dose cannot guarantee that you cannot be out of cancer, even if it is a later effect. So he asked the question, should I live with this stress and tension for more than 30, 40 years to be sure that I am not getting cancer? The numbers are very much scary for them, and they believe if they have inhaled radioactivity or they have worked in the field, they may be subjected to. So where do you draw the line? What to tell and what to not to tell? This is a real challenge as far as experts are concerned when today's public is made aware by the media. Thank you. This is a general comment based upon my experience.
Thank you for your statement. Any reaction to that, or shall we move on? The next speaker is there.
Thank you very much, Thomas Cron from Australia. I found the discussion really wonderful, and I have a question for Professor Lochar about the dialogues. And I wonder if the dialogues also engaged people in the new host communities. We have the dialogue with the people who have to evacuate, but the decision of going back or the overall acceptance of these evacuees depends probably also in a significant way on the new host communities. So I wonder if you have any information or a dialogue with these people, which are sort of second generation victims of these emergency responses.
Thank you for, it's okay? Thank you for your question. I think the dialogue has evolved with the evolution of the situation. At the beginning, it was mainly people, participants were mainly people who were living outside of the evacuated zone. Then, as I mentioned during my presentation, people who were involved were those who were returning, and they were facing new challenges, new problems. And with time, we have tried also to develop dialogues with the new generation. You know, the most recent dialogues, the last 3 dialogues, are mainly devoted to the future of Fukushima with the young generation, those who have returned, but also those who just arrived in Fukushima because of the job, because of decisions to live there, you know, to make business or different motivations. So it's a large diversity of situations. We have even tried to embark people who are not living in Fukushima, but were living in Fukushima at the time of the accident. And there were testimonies of people living in Hiroshima and different cities in Japan presenting their views. It was very enlightening, very, very enlightening.
Thank you.
If I saw correctly, the next speaker was on that side again. Yes, you. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is a very simple one, and this question is to all the people, good brains, in this auditorium today. And we've been working on radiation risk for many, many, many years, spending huge amount of money, so much energy and effort and everything. Communication is one way to deal with, and especially this very tricky risk issue. But I'm always wondering, you know, we are living in a huge level of risks, even external one, chemicals and anything. And very interestingly, radiation is the worst at least theoretically or ideally or whatever it is, people's mind, radiation is the worst element which people are so afraid of. Where did it come? So I've been telling people that be careful about what you eat and don't overeat. That's a good way to get obesity and higher cancer or something like that, These diet things and external things in your lifestyle can give huge difference in cancer incidence and mortality. But radiation is very interestingly really afraid of by especially people, including professionals like us, because we have to deal with it. So I'm always curious about why this culture started, from where and who, and what kind of background systems in our society this danger of radiation, that kind of ideas came out, and still sticking. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I'll respond to that. It's a very interesting point. And as I kind of alluded to in the presentation, that there are some sources which come from history and from misinformation, but I'd also say a word of caution. Sometimes as practitioners ourselves, we do not help ourselves. We decide to talk lots about radiation risk, even when people do not want to know about radiation risk. So it comes back to the point about listen to your people, your stakeholders, to people you're building relationships with, and ask them what they want to know. There's a psychology behind actually saying something safe. The nuclear industry has a terrible habit of saying nuclear safety is our overriding priority. Psychologically, that always makes people think, why are you telling me it's safe? Is it unsafe? So there's a psychology there. So I'd say listen to your stakeholders, actually understand what do they want to know about. Do not always assume it's about radiation risk, but also there is a role to tackle misinformation as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think you were next.
Hello, my name is Sana van Balen. I am from the University of Cambridge. I'm doing my PhD research there. I have a question probably for Peter Bryant, is most relevant. It's regarding the way we talk about these different forms or packages of risk. So you mentioned real risk, perception of risk, and I would add one, feeling of risk as well. We describe them slightly differently. Real risk from industry perspective is analytical, quantifiable. Perception of risk is more characteristics, controllable or voluntary, more or less than something else. And feeling of risk is emotion, often, like you mentioned, fear. What has been your experience in consolidating or connecting these? And does the system of radiological protection facilitate such consolidation?
Well, that's a nice, easy question, isn't it? So I think you're right. There's these different parts, and I'd probably group to some degree perceived and emotional risk as some tie-in there as well. I think let's be honest. The ICRP and the way it's designed, and rightfully, is based on the science. So it is more real risk, is what it looks at. In terms of perceived risk, it is so diverse because it is a personal held view. It is your personal view of how you feel towards a risk, what you believe is risky, your emotional response to it. Do I think the current system of protection is designed to deal with it? Probably not, because it's based on real risk. That is exactly what it should be. And this is where we need to bring in more expertise from others in terms of things like the communication, social science experts to help shape it. But there's a massive part in just listening and realizing everyone is a human and actually being able to have a conversation. I've had to work with parties who've been very adamantly against our project, but I can say I can have actually a very reasonable conversation. We have respect probably for each other, at least I hope we have respect for each other. But that means we can have a disagreement, but still have respect. And that's an important part in having these conversations. So I don't think there's a set answer. I think you're right, there's a difference. I think the system is rightfully based more on real risk. Perceived risk is around the social sciences have a role to play, but also about upskilling people to learn how to communicate. But I'll say it again, We always think that sometimes we make a terrible decision as radiation protection professionals and we stick an expert on the screen to talk to people, and they're not the right person to talk to people. They're not relatable, they can't form a connection with the audience, and the way you're always going to have those difficult conversations is people need to feel there is a connection, a mutual understanding or point of agreement to have those conversations. So work to be done. And I'd love to have a chat with you in the coffee break as well.
Thank you very much.
Next speaker there.
Hi, I'm Sarah Dumit. Pete, you mentioned very well about the importance of building trust. And we know that without trust, the message may likely not be well received by the other party. How do you build trust in a tight time frame? Do you have any examples that you could share or strategies? Sometimes we don't have that much time to do such a challenging job to build the trust. Thank you.
It's an incredibly important question. So obviously you're referring to things like emergency scenarios and incidents that can occur. I can give you tons of examples of how not to do it, because we've had great examples of not doing that well. But I think it comes back to, again, if you know your stakeholders very early on, and you do, you just don't know what you're necessarily going to need to communicate in those difficult periods, start the conversation and building the trust early. It shouldn't be we only start the conversations when we need something. It's got to be we start the conversations because we want to build that enduring relationship, so that when that difficult conversation needs to be had, you've got a foundation of a relationship to have those conversations. So all I'd say is start early, talk early, always be open and transparent, so that actually people will still have an element of trust with you, even in a difficult scenario, because you can go to them and go, look, this is a difficult scenario, raise your hands up, say, we've got a scenario, we've got a problem, let's have a conversation about it. So start it early, even if it's not about that specific topic.
Thank you.
Jacques, you wanted to address the same question?
I think the issue of trust is key. And from my experience, you have to be faithful. If you go to address people because of a situation and they ask questions, or you are confronted with people, you have to listen very carefully. This is extremely important, listening and respect. And part of this respect is to come back again and again. You have to be faithful with the stakeholders you meet. If you go once in a place and explain whatever you want, even if it is sound from the scientific point of view, and you never come back again, you can be sure that the trust will never be there, and you are fight. In fact, you don't give a service to your colleagues that will come later on. I mean, I'm working with some communities in Fukushima. I met them in 2012. I was last weekend with them. We discussed openly, freely. They put some new issues on the table. Trust is there. But it's just because I've been 14 times in this village in this community since I met them in 2012.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, thank you. Panel, for a very interesting set of presentations. For me, they emphasize the importance of trust, in early involvement of stakeholders in design of processes, including communication. So it begs the question for me, really, is to what extent do you think, and dialogue as well was the third point I meant to mention. So to what extent do you think that the ICRP could potentially involve the public or stakeholders in the design of or the review of the radiological protection framework? Do you think there's a role for dialogue, for example, like citizens panels, for example, in the actual review or design of the radiological protection system, and get the public's views in at a very early stage?
I'll go first. And another easy question. Thanks, Andy. I think it comes back to what do people want to know about? We said it before that this should be informed by stakeholders' views. Why not ask the question? Ask the question, do the public want to be involved in it? And in what capacity? What you'll probably find, and I don't know, but you'll probably be, they don't want to sit on all the task groups and hear very technical conversations, but there might be some element that they want to engage on. And the only way we're ever going to know that is if we actually have a conversation.
Okay, I think the next speaker is on that side.
What's the problem?
First of all, thank you. And then, I'm sorry for not speaking Japanese. My name is Ana Rita. I'm from Coimbra. And my question is, why subjects instead of individuals? And I would like all the tables to answer, please. Thank you.
Could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Sure. Why subjects instead of individuals?
Why subject instead of individuals?
Yeah.
No, it's the same. I mean, we are making the difference between subject and object. You know, if you are doing a statistical analysis, people are numbers. They are belonging to a cohort. They have no identity. They are a number, and they are an object. If you speak with people, listen to them, they are a subject, but they are individuals. So it's the same.
Yeah, I'll just follow on to that. It comes back to the point about listening to what people want to know about. So don't think that they always want to know about the topic you think. You do have to listen, and you do have to respond. And really, the important part that Jacques said very, very well, the last point was actually, again, these are relationships. They are long-term relationships. It's not a one-time conversation with an individual. It's a relationship. It's enduring. So you have to keep it going.
Yeah, I agree with Jacques and Peter.
I think
on this.
we can take one more. François, if you agree.
Hi, Dmitry Klokov, IRSN, France. I have two questions for Dr. Lachar.
One.
There are studies, social studies, suggesting that the trust of the public members of the exposed people to the government or government-associated organizations is very low, let alone the industries. They would rather likely trust university experts. So have you experienced in your Fukushima dialogues, have you experienced this? If so, how have you dealt with this? How you presented your experts affiliated with universities like yourself or with other organizations, regulators, ICRP, etc.? And a very quick question, second question, have you been approached by WHO, ICRP, HERCA, and other organizations, committees developing their communication and well-being plans for real feedback, as highlighted by Dr. Bryant in his presentation, sorry. It's a very important, with which I agree, very important aspect to know what people know and want to know before developing these strategies. Thank you.
So the second question is about if we were approached by organizations. Yeah. I think the dialogue started in, this idea of dialoguing with people, which is basically to listen to them and try to put the science at the service of their concerns and their expectations, and to build trust, started in Belarus in a context where we were supported at that time by the European Commission and the Belarus government. In Fukushima, we built on this experience, and exceptionally, we were supported by ICRP, supported in the sense that they said, okay, you have to apply what you know and try to get the lessons. And from the ICRP point of view, it was to understand the situation, to improve the recommendations. So we never were approached by, we know the people from WHO, they are old colleagues, and other organizations, NEA, IAEA, and so on, for many, many years. But we were never approached by them to develop specific projects, but they know what we are doing, and there is no problem there. For the first question, it was about?
Engaging lecturers, academics to speak.
Yeah, I think there is a good example of a successful approach was explained this morning by Takamura Sensei from Nagasaki University. I think academics people have a better, I would say, maybe a better, from the beginning they have a better image than authorities and experts, especially if they are experts from operators and so on. But here again, I mean, the success of Nagasaki University is not because they were coming from university. It was because they engaged, they listened to people, they were faithful to the people they met and they work with. And it's all the same ingredients that it was explained by Peter very well. You know, listening to people, respecting people, and answer their questions, not try to convince them about what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say...
I would have liked to cut the discussion here, but he is a member of the main commission. I can't do that. So, François.
Thank you. François Bochu, from chair of C2. It's just a small comment just to clarify something. The ICRP is not just dealing with the real technical risk. It also deals with perceived risk. You should look in the publication 138 dedicated to ethics. And in the next one, which is about to be published and was slightly presented this morning, about ethics in medicine, in which we deal with empathy, in which we deal with communicating about uncertainties and all this. Clearly, this is something that the ICRP is taking into account. So I wanted just to make sure that we are not considered as being just machines that crumble numbers, and no, we are taking these aspects of communication into account.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry to say, it's almost 7 minutes past the schedule. I'm sorry. Well, in this session, we have many good, valuable discussion and presentations. And this communication in this field is much more important because we are living in a democratic society. All the citizens have an equal right. It means expert is not the exception. So I sincerely appreciate your contribution to this session. Thank you very much.